Hey, it's Alabama Annie with episode 15 of one of my books available on Kindle entitled The Starlight Tavern. We went inside and took a booth in the busy restaurant beside a big Christmas tree, and a waitress wearing a Santa hat took our orders, and we waited for our food to come while Aunt Mary chatted away about how much fun we'd already had, and Albert agreed that it had been nice, but he said, just wait until we go to see the lights. Then our food arrived and we sat eating. Aunt Mary had some pasta and a salad. Albert had a steak with a baked potato, and I really enjoyed the burger and fries with my malt. Then I looked up at Albert and said, "Did you tell Aunt Mary about seeing your friend at the store?" And Albert almost dropped his fork and looked from me to Aunt Mary. "Who was it?" she asked, and he said, "Oh, just an old friend of mine," while he kept his eye on the potato. Then, just to add fuel to the fire, I said, "She was a pretty lady." My Aunt Mary looked from me to Albert and glared at him. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked, and he said he'd planned on telling her later and changed the subject again to the Christmas lights. When we were done eating, we drove up Lookout Mountain in silence, looking down on the city lights. Aunt Mary was very quiet as we rode along, and when we pulled into a big parking lot, he shut off the car and said, "Here we are." I couldn't believe it when I saw that wonderland. I almost felt bad I'd mentioned his friend at all and got him into trouble. There were more Christmas lights than I had ever seen in one place. There were snowmen and elves and live reindeer, and Santa was up in a window of a tall building waving to the crowd. A choir sang carols, and there was a snow-covered cottage called Santa's Playhouse. It was filled with all sorts of toys and surprises. Each child got to take something home with them, and I chose a big pink teddy bear, and after we had cut some hot cocoa, we headed back to the car with me towing that bear. On the ride back to Starlight, I fell asleep, snuggled up against the bear in the back seat. I thought about the day. I thought about Santa and his elves, and about how much fun it would have been to have Betsy in her house on Christmas morning. I thought about that Monopoly game that I could play with Miss Hattie and John and Mr. Harvey, and maybe even Albert and Aunt Mary too. Then I thought about that woman Albert had called Millie. Now, even Mama had old friends, so it passed out of my mind again, but I did understand enough to know that she must have been one of Albert's old girlfriends. And just then, out of the blue, Aunt Mary said, "Who was she, this friend of yours that was so pretty?" And then Albert told her everything, which did surprise me somehow. Maybe he wasn't such a bad guy after all, and at least he was honest. Once we were back at home, Aunt Mary fairly yanked me and the bear from the car and pretty much ordered Albert to bring all of the presents and other things in from the trunk, which he did, and in the parlor she told me to go and wash up for bed. I took my bear and went into the kitchen, and I could hear Aunt Mary shouting at Albert as I stopped at the table to grab a cookie. It was late, and Miss Hattie had already gone to bed. So I took that pink bear to my room. I put him on the bed. I changed into my pajamas. I washed up and brushed my teeth and put myself beneath the covers that night after I said my prayers. I thought about the presents I'd chosen for everyone as I fell asleep. I knew Hattie would love the bathrobe and slippers, and Miss Martha would love her scarf and hat. The last thing I thought of as I fell asleep was that I would have to mail her scarf and hat to her in Birmingham as soon as I could. Then, just like that, school was out for Christmas. There would be 2 entire weeks before we returned again, just after New Year's Day. Mr. Harvey and I walked to the post office that first day off from school, and we mailed off Miss Martha's present with a Christmas card signed by all of us. Then, later that afternoon, everyone met at the church to rehearse for the Christmas pageant. That was the very next day. and the little church would be filled with people. Most of my friends from school were in the play. Several of us were dressed like angels in old choir robes, trimmed with tinsel and covered in glitter, wearing paper wings we had cut from some market paper the grocer in Sequoia had donated for the occasion. Lenny and some other boys were the wise men and shepherds, and one of the boys led a real baby sheep down the aisle. Most of the shepherds wore bathrobes and draped towels over their heads to look like Arabs, and the wise men wore someone's shower curtain fabric or wore colored paper hats with tinsel and tinfoil glued to them. One of the older girls from school played the part of Mary, and the only senior at school, Joseph, became Joseph because he had a real beard. And instead of a doll in the manger, there was a real baby boy. He was only 3 weeks old, and his parents were very proud of little Larry Lee and anxiously stood nearby as he lay in the manger. We all sang Away in the Manger and Star of Bethlehem, and the baby sheep got frightened by something and went running under the pews until one of the shepherds caught the poor little thing again, and baby Jesus started to flail his little arms and legs and cry while we were singing. Afterward, when the pageant was over, we all met in the community hall of the church for coffee, cake, and other holiday treats. All of the ladies had baked for that occasion, including Miss Betty Crudup. There were coconut and chocolate cakes and all kinds of pies and cookies. I had a piece of pecan pie with a cup of hot cocoa and a slice of coconut cake. Almost everything was delicious, with the exception of those cookies Miss Betty had baked for the event. Miss Hattie said Betty Crudup was an odd sort, and Hattie wouldn't touch a single thing the woman made. Miss Betty liked to experiment with food, and being a retired science teacher, she had plenty of time. You would see her out walking the trails along the mountain with a sack slung over her shoulder. That sack would be filled with all kinds of squiggly, wiggly things like earthworms and grubs, tadpoles and mushrooms, berries only the birds would eat, and the roots of plants, including cattails. She would make cookies and pies out of the oddest things. Miss Hattie told me that once she had brought a casserole she'd made to a church dinner, and she said it looked delicious. Uncle John and several other men had scoops of it on their plates and enjoyed it very much and commented on how good it was. One of them asked Miss Betty what was in the casserole. Well, she said, there's chicken broth, grated cheese, stewed tomatoes and earthworms, oh, and some cattail shoots, fresh gathered, of course, and sauteed grubs. She said proudly as several of the people at the table slid back their chairs and ran for the door with their hands to their mouths. One time at school, before I knew about Miss Betty's baking experiments, Mr. Timmons had invited her to come and give a talk about wild edibles, or food that you could gather in the forest. She brought along a big platter of cookies and some crunchy bars for us to snack on during the talk, and told us to help ourselves as she began telling us all about nuts and berries, wild fruit and roots, rose hips, tree sap, pine nuts, pine cones, and sumac. She even told us about flowers that you could eat as she passed around a plate of violets, dandelions, honeysuckle, and even rose petals. We all tried the flowers, and they were very good. While she was talking, I had one of her crunchy bars, and I liked it. So a few moments later, I had another. I had just finished them both, and the rest of the class had eaten most of the cookies as well, when her talk turned to living things that you could eat. She talked about squirrel and rabbit and groundhog and raccoon and quail and dove and grouse, wild turkeys, duck, bird eggs, bear, wild pig, and deer. Then she turned to fishies and reptiles. She talked about bass and brim and catfish and trout and crawdads, and then moved on to frogs, minnows, lizards, snakes, and even salamanders. Sometimes, she said, I gather grubs. Grubs are little crustaceans and they eat wood. If you find a dead tree on the ground and dig around in it, you will find them living there. And they taste quite like shrimp when you boil or fry them, she said, holding several little grubs in her hand as she walked the aisles to show them to us. And I also gather earthworms and beetle larvae, and in fact, those crunchy bars that I brought here today are made from grubs and beetle larvae, Miss Betty announced, as there were sounds of gasps and looks of surprise on our faces while Mr. Timmons sat smiling as he munched on a cookie. Some of the kids complained to their parents that Miss Betty had made us eat bugs, and she never was invited back, but I had to admit the cookies and crunchy bars weren't all that bad, and none of her food would kill you. But it was just a thought of eating a creepy crawly thing in a casserole or in a cookie that set some folks' tummies to rolling. The day after the Christmas pageant was cold and cloudy, threatening sleet or even snow. Uncle John left just after breakfast, bundled against the cold, walking deep into the woods, and returned a while later with a tall cedar tree. We met him at the front porch and held the door open for him as he brought the tree inside and placed it in a bucket of water with a brace to keep it from falling over. He set the tree and the bucket below the staircase on the floor. The cedar smelled wonderful and was at least 10 foot tall. I couldn't wait to decorate that tree, but the weather was turning and Uncle John said there was work to do before we could get to that. As the day went on, it grew colder, and the afternoon was spent hauling in wood, kindling for the stove and the fireplace. Hattie sent me out to gather some eggs from the hen house, and Mr. Harvey brought in a basket of sweet potatoes, onions, and turnips from the garden, and a basket of pecans and walnuts from the barn as well, and just in time, too, because then it had begun to sleet and snow. I was so excited about the snow. I had only seen it a couple of times when Mama and me lived in Birmingham, and then it was only a little dusting of white. Mr. Harvey told me that sometimes we would get lots of snow, and the trees and everything would be covered, and that often the roads would be icy and no one could drive on them. For some reason, that made me happy, and I went into my room to get out of my rain boots and my gloves and warm clothes to wear if it did snow. We had no guests that night at the tavern, and Albert hadn't been around so much after he and Aunt Mary had had that fight over the lady he'd seen in the store, which somehow brightened my spirits as well. While I was eating an afternoon snack, and Miss Hattie was making popcorn for us to string and hang on the big tree, Mr. Harvey came in to say that the roads were icing, and the pass up from Sequoia was already closed, he'd heard, and he'd only seen 2 cars make it up the mountain in the last hour.